So let's start by talking about regular practices. And what I mean by regular practices is the whole gamut of things that people engage to grow in a relationship with Christ and to become conformed to his image. And so obviously, to start with regular practice, that's very vague and incredibly broad. And in my research, that was one of the things that I learned was that the practices that people engaged were all over the planet. There weren't a grouping of specific practices that help people grow in particular. Um, but one of the things I noticed was that practices usually fell into one or two categories. They were either prayer practices or engagements of scripture. Now, the prayer practices, if we identified them, were as many as 30 or 40 different prayer practices. And the same was true about engagement of scripture. It was between 28 and 38 different ways of engaging in the learning of the scripture. So it was impossible to say which of those ways of praying or engaging with scripture was more impactful, but it was always prayer and always scripture that was there. But one of the things that emerged as I learned in the research and engaged with the research was certain realities about prayer and engaging in scripture. And I want to talk about those. One of them was the reality that they were always varied in people's lives. Another one, by varied, I mean people did different things at different stages of their life. And that came through, they would talk about sometimes I will, or I used to, but now I am. They would talk about their spiritual practices in that kind of language. Or for a while, I would engage in this kinds of prayer, and then I tried this kinds of praying. So they would vary their prayer practices regularly in their life. They didn't do the same thing for every day of the week. They didn't do the same thing month by month by month, and they weren't doing the same things in 1 year that they'd done 2 years ago. They varied their practices. They kept them fresh. They did different things at different stages. The other reality is not only did they vary the practices, but they adapted common practices. It was stunning to me at the beginning to realize that no one did spiritual practices in the particular forms that they're taught in either history or in spiritual theology. That everyone took a practice and adapted it to their very specific life. An easy example of that is to talk about Ignatian practice of examen. No one did the examen the way that it was taught by Ignatius, but they would talk about doing a mini examen or an unstructured examen or a dinner time examen. They would talk about doing things with their children at night in bed or at the dinner table or throughout the day. They would think about different things. So they would take the common or normal form as it was taught and adapt it to the way that their life really was. So they could adapt it to their car as they were commuting, or adapt it to their life as it was in one context, and then change it when they moved to another context. People's lives were varied, and they were having to adapt their practices all the time to fit the way life really was. How do they do good spiritual practices in a hectic, fast-paced life? Now, the third thing that we learned about the practices is not only did they vary them radically and adapt them from common tradition in spiritual theology, but that all of the practices, and this was stunning to me, that all of the practices were rooted in community, that all the practices were communal by nature. And what do I mean by that? It didn't mean that they always did their practices with other human beings. It took individual agency, that took individual decision on each person's part, but it meant that they were often feeling that they were stepping into a practice that other human beings were doing together. One person in my research talked about we all the time. He would talk about how he prays through the day. He says he would confidently say, we in the morning will do these kinds of prayers, and at noon we will, and in the evening we will. And I had to ask him, when you use the word we, what are you talking about? Who's with you in that process? And he goes, no, I'm by myself in my home, often in my office. And I had to ask, well, who's the we that you're with? And he's part of a community of Dominican friars who live their life out in communal rhythm. So when he engages a practice by himself in his office, he has the sense that he's stepping into a community of 30 other men who are doing these exact same practices, usually even at the same time. So that was sort of an extreme example, but some others would talk about we's in the context of their church or a faith tradition over time. So we at our church have decided that we're going to read these passages together, or we're going to pray in this way. Some of the members of mission agencies would talk about the we. They would have practices that they engage together, whether it's stillness every morning as they start the day, 30 minutes in silence with the Lord in their offices every day, or gathering together in retreats. There was a sense that they were engaging something in a very communal way. One person had this experience where he does an individualized inductive Bible study in a classic form every night. And he hadn't missed an inductive Bible study engagement in his life for the last 5 years. So I was like, when I was doing the research, I was like, this is blowing the model a little bit. He's got this individualized thing. It's just this little Bible study he does every night by himself. And at the end of our interview, he said, well, I think I forgot to tell you something about my Bible study. I was like, what was that? He goes, at the end of every Bible study, I write a summary of what God said to me and what I think he's inviting me to do with it. And then I send it out as a tweet. So I said, well, why did you do that? Because at the beginning, I decided that if I was going to do this practice and I valued it, I would use myself against myself. So instead, if I told people that I was going to do a Bible study every night, and that they could expect me to tweet about it, that I would never miss it because I would be too ashamed to let my friends down. I would use myself against myself. So that helped me stay accountable to the process at the very beginning. And he said after 2 years, I didn't need the accountability. It would become a habit in my life. But I loved the process of tweeting it because other people would join in, or they would speak to me about what God was saying to me in my process. They would affirm it, they would encourage it. Sometimes they would join in. And then after about 3 years, multiple people started joining him in the process of learning the same scriptures. So the tweet became a conversation about what God was saying to a community of people and how God was inviting people to different behaviors and common behaviors and transformative behaviors differently through the scriptures, the same scriptures that they were engaging with on a day in, day out process. The community is an important driver to our process. It helps us become the kind of people we want to be, and it helps us do the things we want to do but often don't do by ourselves. There's so many things that I want to do that I don't do alone, that I would more aptly do when I have a community of people helping me be the kind of person I want to be, and actually hold me accountable to it, but also join me. The community provides energy to engagement with prayer and with scripture. So the practices that we engage in a formation group are always varied. We change them up a lot. We adapt them from common spiritual practices. We make them work in modern life with modern technologies, and we always engage them in a context of community. We vary them, we adapt them, and we make them communal.